So this is a unique video in that I'm actually starting from the end and going in reverse order. It didn't occur to me as I took on the project that I should actually film this and show people how to do it. So I'm going to start off showing what the end result will look like, and then I'll re-edit the videos to show you the steps in which to do it. So the problem I had was I had leaking fuel underneath the intake manifold in this 1991 318IS, an M42 motor. It's found in 318Is and 318ISs, and it's probably similar in the M44, but I don't know. So the problem I had was underneath the intake manifold, which would be here, there was fuel dripping, or fuel could be seen falling onto this wire box, plastic box, and it turns out the fuel lines were cracked and a little brittle. The camera can't pick it up, but there was a little dry rot going on in here. So there's some cracks on that one, and there were cracks, a lot of cracks in the other one, and so I replaced them. So what you'll need is I use OE, genuine BMW fuel line. The size is 8 by 13. That was what I found printed on the old one, the existing one. I had a couple extra lying around, don't ask, and you just cut it to size. To get these off, you use a flathead screwdriver to loosen these little worm clamps. They're kind of special worm clamps. They really hold the fuel line in place. What I ended up doing was you loosen, work one at a time, loosen these up, you pull the screws out, pull the screw out, and you'll be able to kind of pry the worm clamp out a little bit. When you pry it out of the way, you should have some more wiggle room. You also want to, so you'll pull fuse number 11 out, start the car, let it run until it starves the fuel, it'll shut off. Then you'll kind of depressurize the fuel system a little bit. Once you loosen these worm clamps, you pull the screws out, you'll be able to kind of pull these down a little bit. I used a pair of needle nose pliers to help pull this down. I also found it useful to use, I think it was a 10mm or 11mm socket to loosen the nut that's on here. And this basically holds these the steel or metal fuel lines in there, in place, and it will allow you to pull down on it or push up into it when you go to reinstall or uninstall and reinstall. If you have a fuel line, spare fuel line, again, you want to use the right one. I don't have the part number on it. Actually, I do. Part number I used is 16121180409. And that's it. Another tip before I forget, when you go to reinstall the metal line into the rubber fuel line, a couple of tips and tricks. I found using a little PD blaster to lubricate the inside of the rubber hose to get it onto the nipple works out really well. And also make sure you don't tighten these before you get it on there. You might have to shimmy it up a little bit, put the metal fuel line in there, and then shimmy the worm clamp back on top over it, and then tighten it up. Otherwise, it might be a really tight fit. And if you're like me, it's a good time to also replace your upper intake manifold gasket. I had an extra one that came in the car, so I replaced it. And I also cleaned out the intake runners with a little carb cleaner, intake body, an air intake cleaner. And I also cleaned or tried to clean the throttle body housing as well. So I'm going to start putting things back together. To start, we're going to remove this vacuum line. Just pull off the valve cover housing there by just pulling it off and get it out of the way. There's also a tiny vacuum line here that we're going to remove from here. Just pull it out of the way, and this will be attached to the throttle body housing. It's hard to get to it because it's underneath all of this stuff. You'll only be able to reconnect it once this is actually off the. So we're going to use a flathead screwdriver to loosen this worm clamp. We're also going to use one to loosen this worm clamp. We're going to unplug the throttle position sensor, and we're going to pull this vacuum line out, and then we're going to tack these there's actually 5 nuts with a 10mm socket. This pries off very simply by, once you loosen the worm clamp, you can use your hand or a screwdriver under there to leverage this out, and this slides off. The same with this side as well. Then just unplug and remove the wires and everything out of the way. So there's 4 bolts that hold the throttle body housing onto the intake manifold. They're 10mm bolts. Nuts. I keep saying bolts. They're nuts. 1, 2. There's one in the bottom corner, one in the other opposite corner, and there's a 5th one down here where my finger's pointing to, there's a post there. You take the nut off, and then, or on, and then there's this little loose aluminum piece that holds, there's like some valve body that mounts the bottom by nothing to the throttle body housing, and this little piece holds it on. So just remove that to get to the last part of the throttle body housing. The bolts that hold the intake manifold around the perimeter, they're all 11mm nuts. Use a socket to pull them out. There's a number of them, just follow around. On the side here, again, use an 11mm socket or an open-end box wrench to loosen it up. And there's also one on this side, I'll show you from a different angle, with a bracket holding it in. That'll be like the last piece holding it in. When you take all the nuts off, you just kind of lift the intake manifold up and out. You'll have to snake it over this vacuum line here. Just try not to rub it and press too much pressure on here. And once it comes out of the way, then you'll have access to the fuel line or the lower intake manifold gasket. Next, you're going to loosen the little rubber hose here on the ICV, or the idle control valve. It gets pulled off of the nipple here, and there's also a bolt that attaches to the intake manifold stud that you'll also want to loosen up. So generally the last bolt holding, or nut rather, holding the intake manifold is located on the passenger side of the vehicle, right below the ICV. You pull this, there's a hose, pull that hose off. Below that is 11mm nut. It's right underneath it. You'll feel it. Loosen it up with a wrench. And there's a bracket on there. Just take the nut all the way off. You can leave the lower one on. You don't have to loosen it. You can take it off if you want. You'll see what it looks like when you get there. The camera's not showing it because it's too dark here. Okay, so see that post, that stud over there? There's a bracket. There's a small little bracket. Sorry for the. There we go. There's a bracket. That post the bracket gets mounted on that like this, and it's really hard to show on the camera, but that's the last bracket that will hold in the intake manifold. So you want to get it started with the top bolt, and this kind of bracket, this camera's not picking it up, it's held on with a 11mm nut. So get it started, and then hand tighten it, and then tighten it up with your wrench once you get it all. There's also a 10mm nut that holds this clamp on here for the hard fuel lines. You just want to loosen the nut, take it off all the way, and this clamp that's on there will come off and allow you to freely move and wiggle these hard fuel lines. When you need to remove the rubber ones, you'll need access to them by removing this clamp. Here's my special helper. She's watching.